So let's start with the presentations, and the first would be about the introduction of translational medicine, which is, I think, one of the biggest advantages in medicine in the 21st century. And first question is, because we always have questions, so let's go through with questions. What is translational medicine? Actually, in the past, medicine was together, actually, clinical and basic science were together, and somebody who was next to the bedside went down to laboratories, performed clinical trials, and brought back the knowledge to the bedside. Therefore, any kind of clinical questions were actually asked at the bedside, immediately could go back to the patients. However, the medicine divided the two main areas to basic science and clinical science, and actually those medical students who finishing the university needs to choose whether they go to a theoretical department, to anatomy, physiology or the others, and they never see patients again, or they go to a clinical field but they never think about basic or scientific questions again. And they realize that this is not good, because this means that science actually reducing the speed, and the knowledge gained on different scientific projects now very rarely going back to the patient's bed. So actually translational medicine is a process of putting together the different areas of medicine and actually speed up the scientific knowledge back to the bedside. So there are lots of various existing definitions concerning translational medicine, but it's very important that this is highly interdisciplinary. You will see today how many biostatistics you need to do that. Of course, if you're not doing meta-analysis but clinical trials, you need ethical issues. Of course, you need IT persons who set up the different places for electronic clinical research force. But the main issue is all efforts made by translational medicine directly going to have patients benefit. So this is actually the system for translational medicine. First, you need a healthcare center which provides valuable data for science and for data registries. This can be called translational healthcare. You raise the question here. Secondly, you need to have scientific activity, either basic, applied, or clinical science, and this will result in scientific publications. The next one is about the knowledge. You need to summarize the knowledge somehow, because daily more than 10,000 articles coming up on PubMed. Nobody actually can follow the results if there is nobody who put together. And you need somehow educate the people, also the patients, politicians, healthcare professionals, and provide bringing it back to practice. So this is translational medicine. Unfortunately, most of the cases translational medicine thought only in science, that somebody using clinical samples and they call it translational medicine. This is translational science, but translational medicine is where the question coming from the patients and the results arise back to the patients. So what is translational healthcare? In a normal system, you have nurse, residents, consultant in the unit, but in a good translational healthcare place, you have data managers, patients coordinators, and also PhD students. And there is a very firm collaboration between different disciplines, the ER, lab medicine, and all the others. Of course, you need a highly interdisciplinary unit where you have medical group coordinators who coordinate the different efforts. Today, this meeting actually organized by Zsolt Szakács, who led actually the meta-analysis group. You need IT persons, statisticians, you need data managers, and of course you need public relations also to bring back every knowledge. And this is about our activities. Currently, more than 100 meta-analyses we have started to organize. we have more than 30 registers already started, 9 clinical trials, and 3 patients clubs. So if you go to our web page, you can see actually the different activities. We would like to build up as many as study groups we can do. And after these study groups would organize the registries, meta-analysis, clinical trials, and also the patients club. We have quite a lot study groups already. And current activities, of course, this is what we started the meta-analysis. We built up study groups, we built up registries, and we built up different clinical trials. So what is translational science? Because it's always a problem with meta-analysis that people don't know what does it mean in science, whether it's a science, it's a review, or where to put this knowledge. Science actually is a systematic enterprise which organizes knowledge in a testable explanations, and very importantly, this must be reproducible and must be objectives. And if many people with different ways finding the same results for an unknown question, this is called to science. So you need always a question, you need a hypothesis, you need a methodology, collecting data, analysis and answers. And this is called actually science. So what kind of science can be raised during your medical career? Of course, you can have basic scientific question if you would like to discovering new mechanisms. Of course, there is applied science where you're developing new drugs and interventions under already having knowledge, and the clinical science which actually a practical application, understanding safety and effectiveness. And of course, there are many different methodology for that. And of course, plenty of people can use and plenty of questions can be answered only if you combine this kind of methodology. Of course, in basic science, what can we do with the knowledge? Of course, we give presentations like theoretical background. What can you do with the clinical knowledge? Of course, you use it in clinical practice and you can teach it. There are a couple of methodologies which usually used by basic scientists. There are a couple of methodologies which usually used only by clinicians, but I must say almost all of the methodologies can be used anyone and doesn't need to be a medical doctor. So let's look at which methodologies are usually taught and used in Hungarian universities. Of course, this is covered by most of the universities and research groups, like for example pathophysiology or pathology. Also pharmacology is covered, but unfortunately concerning clinical science almost only use the retrospective data analysis and not the other mechanisms. So this is usually not covered. It was the same during your voting. 85% of you mentioned that you didn't learn almost anything from meta-analysis. So this is a pyramid for clinical research. Of course, there is retrospective analysis, prospective registries, observational, controlled and randomized clinical trial. And where can we put meta-analysis? Meta-analysis is a summary of the current available knowledge, and it means that doesn't matter which kind of articles you collect, all of them can be collected. So meta-analysis in some textbooks are usually put to the top of the system. However, it's not true, because if the meta-analysis is done by retrospective analysis only, the value of the meta-analysis will be less than a randomized clinical trial. So meta-analysis actually summarizing all of the data you have. And of course, to make prospective registries, you need to work with IT biostatistics, as I mentioned, and to run up a clinical trial, of course, you also need a team who can organize clinical trial. So let's look at why do we start with meta-analysis, because later on our interdisciplinary unit will give actually different postgraduate or undergraduate courses, not only on meta-analysis, but also on registry analysis and also on clinical trials. If you look at about the data in a PubMed, Meta-analysis is quite a new technique and still rapidly growing. So if you click on the PubMed, you already can see more than 150,000 items. Thus this is a really well used by many of the investigators. No restrictions. You can ask either basic or clinical scientific questions, and you can answer both. So all basic scientists and clinical scientists can do. Easy to learn. It helps to identify the holes in our knowledge. This is excellent learning method of the good publication practice, and you can get a quick answer to your questions. If you would like to help on patients, of course, what chance you have? Of course, you can design new drugs. But if you think about how long does it take to bring a drug back to the patient, sometimes it's more than 20 years. Of course, if you have either a basic or clinical questions or you perform a clinical trials, it's usually from 5 to 10 years. It's also very slowly to bring back knowledge to the patients. Registry data is easier because if you would like to understand some questions, you build up a registry which could be within 6 months. You can start collecting data within 2 years. You analyze it, so this is a quicker method. But the quickest method, actually the fastest method, actually the meta-analysis, because the data already available on the different database sources, and you can collect them with no restrictions. So actually very quick, and it's really depend on you how long does it take a meta-analysis. I could see currently the world champion meta-analysis were done within 2 weeks, but of course this is not a normal one, and many people were working on it. Usually it's between 6 months and 1.5 years. It's a normal time for a meta-analysis. And the meta-analysis will show you where are the gaps, and if there are gaps, it will show you how you can get more knowledge, whether you need to build up a registry or you need to go down to do basic science or trials. However, this is almost the only methodology which results can immediately giving back to patients benefit, because if you find the meta-analysis is a confirmed answer to your questions, you can use it for patients' benefit. There is always a mixture concerning systematic review and meta-analysis, and unfortunately universities at university level also they mix it up. The way is why, because the systematic review also needs specific question, comprehensive search. It also can help to answer the questions. However, systematic review is a qualitative synthesis of data. Usually we do systematic review when we don't have numbers, and there are not enough studies to perform meta-analysis, and this is only a qualitative synthesis. So systematic review, it's also inside the name that this is review. This is a review type article. However, meta-analysis is not a review, because this is a quantitative synthesis, and if you look at the name, meta-analysis, so there is data analysis in it, and you got the results and you get numbers. So meta-analysis is a science, and this should be used for PhD degrees, for DSc degrees, habilitations, for everything, and the coming out a scientific publication. However, systematic review is summarizing the data, so this is like a guideline. This is actually a knowledge publication. The mixture is because plenty of times you not only do qualitative analysis, but quantitative as well, and plenty of times we publish that a meta-analysis and a systematic review, which means that both qualitative and quantitative analysis are in the publication. So let's go through what is translational knowledge. So you could see that there are many scientific publications, but you need to be ordered to get actually an evidence-based guideline. And the knowledge summary is like systematic review and evidence-based guidelines. Why do you need evidence-based guidelines? Actually, the first one who wrote it was Feinstein and Cochrane, who said that very important to have the evidence-based guidelines because one doctor experience is less than having 100 doctors and hundreds of thousand patients experience. And one people can have a bias in the view, but if you look at the clinical questions which already decided on the different trials, this will give you a final answer. And this should be actually the evidence-based summary should be used for teaching, decision making, and improving financial issues. This is actually the form of the medical treatment of a patient in the last century. Doctors needed a lot of local experience and their own experience because the knowledge was not available. There were no evidence-based guidelines or whatsoever. And of course, it depends also on the financial opportunities what healthcare ministry actually provided for the country. So the healthcare are different in different countries. Evidence-based guidelines made by the societies, and very importantly, totally independent from a single person experience and the financial opportunities, use the evidence-based medicine always using the guidelines only published data which you have evidences. And this is crucial to give a good decision. The most beneficial for a patient when there is already high evidence for a question, the doctors know this evidence, and there is a financial support for this evidence. Just one example, how important is evidence-based guideline. We analyzed the Hungarian patients actually who were collected to a registry, and data were collected from 28 different hospitals. This was 600 patients. And the aim of this study was to understand how the patient's outcome different if your adherence to the guideline is strong or weak. For example, fluid resuscitation, in the guideline it's clearly stated in acute pancreatitis that the patient should get an immediate high volume resuscitation within the couple of 2 hours, and after that the patient should get around 2.5 to 4 liters of fluid daily. We looked at the patients, 50% received actually the evidence-based form of the fluid resuscitation, the other 50% didn't. Let's look at the outcome. Those where the evidence-based guideline was kept correctly, it was 1.5%. In those patients where the evidence-based fluid therapy was not kept and used the local strategy, was 3.8%. This is the same in severe pancreatitis. It was 11.5% and 18.4%. We looked at another marker, for example, enteral feeding. No, enteral feeding is compulsory in severe pancreatitis. In those groups who got the enteral feeding, it was 21% the mortality in the severe group. In those, it was 47% who didn't. So if you look at this map, I think this clearly shows that evidence-based medicine should be compulsory, and unfortunately, less than 5% of the international guidelines are translated to Hungarian. And this is not good at all. And let's look at the results. For example, in Hungary, there are 5,000 to 7,000 patients, and one severe pancreatitis costs around 6,000 euros because the patients are around 60-70 days in the hospitals. In mild pancreatitis, the patients are around 4-5 days in the unit and cost 350 euros. Let's look at theoretically. If people would use the evidence-based guidelines correctly and we could reach a 100% adherence in Hungary to the evidence-based guideline in acute pancreatitis, we could decrease the number of severe pancreatitis almost with 7%, and we could decrease the mortality with 2.3%. This would mean 161 survivals, and in this one disease only, we could save 2.5 million euros. In one disease, let's think about how many diseases are there. this would count that we could save 14,000 euros and the life almost every second days in one disease. So what is translational education? Of course, you need the grade of evidences as we discussed, and this was a question as well. Of course, for all statement in medicine, should be a strength of recommendation which could be 1 or 2, strong or weak. And you need an evidence level which could be high, moderate or low. And the final point is about the consensus. If there is a room, there is a consensus concerning full agreement, strong agreement, weak disagreement or strong disagreement. For example, if the vote's above 95%, it means strong agreement. For example, that today is Friday. We can say that there is a strong, with high evidence, and the consensus level was actually total agreement. And also in the education, we should bring similar slides, also articles about the guidelines. We have done in it pancreatology, and we really hope that all areas of medicine for every international guidelines will be translated to Hungarian. Let's the 7th question, who wins by translational medicine? And our opinion that this is the win-win-win situation, everyone win, but the biggest winner are the patients always. For example, we looked at the enteral feeding, and for example, just a matter, we had basic science results that early energy damage are there in acute pancreatitis. What we have done, we for example did a meta-analysis whether very early enteral feeding would give benefits for the patients. And the meta-analysis showed that not only severe but also patients suffering from mild pancreatitis can get benefits from early enteral nutrition. Therefore, we started in PAGE to give early enteral feeding for all patients based on the data. Actually, this methodology already it was in the guidelines that enteral feeding can be used. So this is not an off-label, but about we changed the timing. And just only changing the timing resulted that here all patients got feeding. Here in the registry, almost all patients got Nilperos diet. We could reduce the amount of severe and moderate pancreatitis. We could decrease the days of hospitalization by 2 days in every patient. For example, in one university like in PAGE, this decreased 400 days, the hospitalization in one disease. And if you look at the mortality, the general mortality in severe pancreatitis is 28% based on Hungarian and international registries, and we could decrease it to 10%. And we could reduce the usage of antibiotics from 70% to 35% in mild pancreatitis and also the necrosis. And a meta-analysis led the knowledge whether this early enteral feeding is really beneficial for the patients. Let's look at the healthcare budget. We made an analysis also about the economy. And it means not only for patients' benefits, but at the University of PAGE, one patient's cost is 25% less than another university center if you count all the budgets spent on the disease. Let's look at the scientists. And for example, if you look at the Department of Gastroenterology, which is a clinical department of PAGE, we established our center in 2016. The green is about the impact factor by a year by the scientist who started working in the translational medicine. Red is the citations. So you can see that all of the clinicians get huge amount of benefits actually by establishing this translational medicine center. And let's look at about the basic science department, the Department of Pathophysiology. If you look at also the individual scientist outcome, it really elevated a lot for all. And if you look at the citation index also went up. If you look at the institutions, we could get 2 translational medicine grants. Both of them are 1.5 billion Hungarian forints. And also if you look at about the institute units in pathophysiology and gastroenterology, the annual impact factor, this is also elevated about 5 to 6 times within 2 years of period. So our aim, this Center for Translational Medicine in Page, to develop, apply and share the knowledge of translational medicine and offer the service of our core facility. So this is one of the events. Today you will learn, hopefully, with a much better results of the voting at the end about meta-analysis. So I would like to thank all of the team in advance to get this course together. And if you would like to perform meta-analysis, we will show you later that you can join and we can discuss about the different projects and we can help you during the whole course of meta-analysis. So thank you very much for your attention.